All right. Well, I'm Steve Kozak, and I'm excited to be with you guys tonight. And we're going to talk about meters 101, just kind of a basic class and a review of in-camera meters as well as handheld meters and why you might choose to use one over the other. Um, so I'm going to ask Bridget to monitor the chat. If y'all want to put questions in the chat, she can interrupt me from time to time and ask your questions. I probably will get to most of them, but if you've got something that you missed that I said or whatever, I'm happy to go back. This will be pretty casual. It's just us kids, right? And so we're just here to have a good time and learn something. So thanks for being here. So let's go out to Monument Valley. You know, it's time to start getting out of the house a little bit more. So let's take a trip to Monument Valley and go stand on the overlook and photograph the mittens. So we'll be out there kind of late in the day. Sun's starting to go down a little bit. I can tell that because the shadows are creeping up in the foreground, and the shadow of the near mitten is starting to cast itself on the far mitten back there. But the question is, what does the camera see in this instance? It has no idea if you're photographing the mittens or Nags Head, North Carolina National Seashore or Red River snow. You know, it just doesn't know what you're photographing. But it's trying to make decisions for you about exposure. And so how can it really do that if it doesn't really know what it's looking at? Well, all it really sees are tonal values. And so when you see this image of the shadows in the foreground and the bright sky in the background and the sunlight directly on the mittens, as determining the exposure, its job is to find the average. And so it takes a look at the foreground, takes a look at the middle ground, takes a look at the tonal values in the sky, and averages all of those out to give you a net result. And I know this is happening because I can see that my exposure mode was on auto. And I can also see that in auto exposure mode, it chose F8 at 125 with an ISO of 100. And so this is what we get. And sometimes people will put a photograph like this up on Facebook and people will just say, "Oh, that's such a lovely photograph." And, and I just kind of want to gag because I know that there are serious problems, but, I don't consider myself the Facebook police, so I just stay out of it. But we have a very simple rule that we can follow that tells us what the exposure is on most daylight conditions, such as full sun or partial sun or overcast or even heavy overcast. And if we just followed that rule, we would be able to look at this and say, well, gosh, it's a sunny day, full sun, at least on the mittens, because that is our subject, by the way. We don't really care what's in the foreground. We care about what's on the mittens. And if that's in full sun, our sunny 16 rule tells us that it's f16 at 125. So if I had shot that at f16 at 125, I would have gotten proper exposure. So here's a case where using either program, aperture priority, or shutter speed priority, the camera's just averaging, and it got it wrong by about 2 stops. And that's not uncommon. I've seen 3 and 4 stop mistakes when using any of those automatic modes, program, aperture priority, or shutter speed priority. In addition to just getting the exposure wrong, oftentimes those modes can't translate for us the vision that we see or the vision that we have for an image. So here's another image that I took from Monument Valley, and it was very late in the day. It was, matter of fact, it was getting not dark, but getting close to dark. There was no visible sun in the sky. And man, the clouds were just amazing, and the landscape was just flat and ugly. But I just saw this old juniper tree down there, and I thought, you know, I'm going to go photograph that kind of as a foreground interest and do it in silhouette. So I thought, after I took it, it's like, oh my gosh, these are marvelous just for fun. Let me shoot it in program and see what I get. So you can see the exposure on the left is what you get in program. The exposure on the right is what I saw. It's what I wanted to accomplish. And I will tell you, it's about a 6 stops difference in exposure between those two. So program, aperture priority, shutter speed priority would have failed me miserably. I will say that the camera meter seems to get it wrong almost 100% of the time, except in the case where you're doing silhouettes. And it's really the one time where the camera meter is superior. And I'll show you how to do those here in just a bit. So I'm just, you know, kind of beating up aperture priority, shutter speed priority, and program a little bit. I'm going to beat it up a little bit more because here's another image that I took at Valley of Fire outside of Las Vegas. And again, kind of took one for me and one in program just to be able to illustrate the difference. And the image on the left is just nothing. And I'm not sure the image on the right is anything, but it's a whole lot more interesting than the image on the left. And again, I'm using manual exposure to create the vision that I have and the vision that I saw when I was in that venue. And so that's kind of my compelling argument for you guys, is to really start shooting your camera in manual mode. Before we do that, let's talk about how the camera figures out how to calculate an exposure for you. And we're going to begin by looking at some of the metering modes. Now, these metering modes control how much of what you see in the viewfinder is included in the decision making for determining the exposure. And I will say that the terms evaluative and matrix, those are proprietary terms to the camera manufacturers. So if you look at your instruction book and you don't see matrix mode anywhere in your instruction book, well, that's because it belongs to one of the other camera manufacturers. And I don't know, there's so many cameras out there, and mirrorless cameras and all those things that are out there anymore, that I don't know if they have their own proprietary terms as well. I assume they do. But one of the things that's pretty universal is this little logo or this little icon. And when you're dialing through those icons on your camera, you should see very similar icons throughout all these. So the first one that we'll talk about is evaluative or matrix. And this is pretty much where the camera uses everything that you see within the viewfinder to determine the exposure. So it's using foreground, middle ground, background, left, right, up and down, and all values in the middle to sort of come up with the average exposure. As you might guess, it's probably the least effective of the metering modes because it's measuring so much that we don't care about. What we really care about is the exposure on our subject. And in almost all instances, when we take a photograph, there is a main subject that we're interested in. Even in landscape photography, there is a main subject, hopefully, that or at least a center of interest that you're trying to present. And that's all we care about. So we don't care about all this other stuff. So why would we include it in the determination of the exposure? The next one is center weighted. Again, it may have its own unique name in your camera line, but it basically takes some of the edges off of its evaluation process and includes more of the center portion of the viewfinder. And probably a little more accurate than matrix, but still probably not as accurate as we would like it to be, because again, it's including far more than we care about. The next mode is partial metering mode. And as you can see, that area of determination is getting smaller and smaller and smaller until finally we get to spot metering mode. And there's a lot of folks who recognize the value of spot metering. And I think if you're going to use any of the metering modes, spot metering is probably your best bet, because again, you can set your exposure on your primary center of interest and not include all the other peripheral elements that the camera would take into account. It's always interesting when I teach a class, even at Texas school, at the Texas school level, people come into that class and they don't realize their camera has a meter inside of it. And so I just don't assume anything anymore. And there may be some of you who don't realize that your camera has a meter inside of it. So what I'd like to do is to have you get your camera out, and we're going to kind of play with it. We're going to discover the meter inside your camera. So get your camera out. I'm watching you. We're all going to put our cameras on 800 ISO. 800 ISO is a good spot for everybody to be. So many of you got to get it off of auto ISO, because if you're on auto ISO, you're really on program, right? You're really not making any determinations about your exposure. So part of shooting in manual is also to set the ISO for the scene that you're photographing. So we're going to put it in 800 ISO, and then I'm going to ask you to set your camera into manual mode. So you got to turn that dial over to the M, and then set it to F4, and let's say at maybe a 30th of a second. F4 at 1/30th of a second. Don't get the shutter speed confused with 30 seconds. Be sure you're seeing a 30th of a second, and then on either side of it, 1/15th or 1/60th. But at F4 at a 30th of a second at 100 ISO, 800 ISO, you can now put your camera up to your eye and then touch that shutter button, like the halfway point, or just touch it. And you want to look inside that viewfinder to find that graph or that meter. Most of you will have something that looks similar to what you're seeing on my screen. And as you look through your viewfinder, I want you to point it all around the room. Point it like directly at the lights, point it at the floor, point it at your desk or table, point it at the walls, point it at your hand. And you may have to keep touching the shutter every time, because when you touch the shutter down and you just hold it, it tends to lock in whatever exposure you just set. So you want to be able to see it reading at all those different settings and see that graph moving. Your graph may go to 3 stops under, all the way up to 3 stops overexposed. My little graph example here, it just shows -2 to +2, but get the feel of that graph. And maybe in there also, you'll be able to actually see the f-stop and the shutter speed that you've chosen. It should indicate that to you as you look through there. So is anybody not seeing all that? Everybody's seeing it. Okay. I'm assuming we're good. Bridget, if we're not, then interrupt me and tell me. So here's the premise when you're shooting in manual mode. The camera thinks you are properly exposed when the light on that graph, or the line on that graph, is right there at the center, right in the middle. So if you're pointing your camera up towards the light, I expect that graph is going to go way to the overexposed side. And if you point it down to the floor, I expect that graph is going to go way to the underexposed side. What I'd like you to do is point it up towards the light, and then you have to choose. Do I change the f-stop to get the graph back to the center while you're looking through there? Physically change the f-stop. do I change the shutter speed or do I change the ISO? So I kind of want us to do all three of those. I'd like you to point your camera at the light and let's all move our f-stops in order to get that graph back to the center. And it wouldn't surprise me a bit to see that go up to, you know, F8, F11, maybe even more, maybe 16, depending on how bright your lights are. But if you can get it while you're pointed at the light and get that graph in the center, then you have been given notice that the camera thinks that's the proper exposure. Now, whether it is or not, that's a different story right now. But that's what the camera thinks is the proper exposure. So if that worked for you, let's go back to F4 where we were. And this time, let's point it at the light and let's change the shutter speed to get the graph to the center. And again, we're going to be speeding that shutter up. I think we were at a 30th of a second. It wouldn't surprise me to see you have to go to 250 or 500, maybe even faster if your light's bright, if you're pointing at an extremely bright light. All right. So now then, let's go back to F4 at 30. Excuse me. And let's find, I don't know, something in a neutral tonal value, not like a dark carpet, not like a dark wall, but also nothing bright like a light. If you've got maybe a sheet of paper nearby or a door or a white wall or something that's kind of neutral that you could point your camera at, I want you to point your camera at that item or that subject, and now change the ISO to get the graph to the center. And I don't really know what to expect here for you guys. I've chosen a high enough ISO that I would assume you might have to decrease your ISO a little bit, but again, depending on the room environment, you may have to increase your ISO. So it's kind of a big unknown, but you just want to change it until the graph moves back on center.
Oh no.
All right. Any questions, any problems, anything unusual going on? All right. So there's the three ways you set your camera in manual mode to determine, at least to let the camera determine what it thinks is the proper exposure. You just look at that graph and you either use the f-stop, the shutter speed, or the ISO to get that graph on center. And once it's on center, then that's where the camera thinks it's seeing proper exposure. So let me unshare for a minute here. And let's go look at some things on my camera. So this is a little tricky here. Give me just a second. I'm going to turn this off, get to see my green screen. Yay. And then I'm going to go to this camera. If you'll put your zoom mode into full screen view so that you can see my window only, it might be helpful because we're going to look at some of the details on my camera from this overhead view. So if you see all of the people in the Zoom, then go up in the upper right-hand corner of the window where it says view and change that into speaker view. And then that way you should be just on my camera. Okay, so I'm going to activate my camera, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, but hopefully this will be helpful to you. So right here is my focusing mode. I've got that set in spot mode, spot metering mode. You want to double check your camera as well and see which mode you're using. Again, my preference is to use spot metering. I hesitate to go out here and change everything that you are doing with your camera. But if you're kind of learning and this is sort of new to you, I would say this is a great place to start. How do you change that? Well, you hold this button down right here. It should have a little picture of the different metering modes, and then you just either dial the wheel in the back or the dial in the front, or however you have to use. Some of you will even have a touch screen maybe, and you can just dial through those different metering modes. You can also see on my camera here that I do have a meter visible even in the top of the camera. Of course, I probably never use that. I use the one inside the viewfinder because that's the business end of what's going on. Okay. If you don't know how to get it set to spot metering mode, then I would consult your instructions or go online and see if you can find some instructions, and that will help you work through some of those things. So let me go back to my screen. And then this is kind of what we just did as we look through these here. I've got my camera trained in on my model. When you're in spot metering mode, it uses the box that you've activated for your selection points. Each of these little boxes, and again, every camera is different, right? So it's really difficult for me to tell you, exactly what you're seeing or to anticipate anything about what you're seeing, really. But I like to limit my focus points to a single focus point. I don't let my camera choose where the focus points are. I physically move the focus points in the viewfinder to be one of these boxes, one of these 9 boxes. Your camera could be set up with, I don't know, 70 boxes or 50 boxes or 12 boxes, or I don't know what all they have. But I kind of like this little compact arrangement here. And what that allows me to do is move my point of focus through the viewfinder wherever my subject is. So you can see this is the center. Well, I don't want to focus there. I want to focus on her face. So I have told my camera, use this box. Okay. And again, once you have it in that mode, I just dial the wheel and dial it around and it lights up whichever box I want. The thing about doing this is that's also the box where it takes your spot metering information from. So if I'm using this box out here on the left as my point of focus, that's where it's going to spot meter. It's not going to spot meter in the center. If I choose this box over here on the right, that's the point where it's going to spot meter. So again, I like that it's metering exactly where I know where it's metering, because I've told it which box is the focus point, and that's the box that I want to meter on. Some of you will use the center box for focusing, and you tend to leave it there. And one of the mistakes that you might be making is, let's say you wanted to photograph her, you would point your camera towards her so that the center box went on her face, and you would set the focus, and then you would recompose the shot. Well, that causes you some focus problems, some back focus issues. There's some geometry in there that I won't try to go through and explain here, but anytime you're changing that distance by taking that focus point from a different place and then recomposing the image, you're actually most likely shifting the focal point behind your subject. And I can show you that if any of you have any dire questions about it. It's kind of interesting and it's kind of eye-opening if you've been doing it that way. But this just eliminates that altogether because you just activate the box where you want that focus point to be. So in this case, my meter's telling me, it's telling me that I'm set at f4 at 30, but I'm 2 stops overexposed. So I need to make a change. So I think I'm going to make an adjustment to my shutter speed in this example. And when I adjust it, now then f4 at 250 moves the graph to the center. Now I'm properly exposed and ready to go. But you also know, if you've studied photography long enough, that we have these things called equivalent exposures, right? And so it's the equivalent exposures where the magic of photography really happens, because being able to choose a particular f-stop or a shutter speed allows us to alter the world as we see it. We can use a shallow depth of field by using a large lens opening and throw the whole world in the background out of focus. That doesn't happen in real life, right? We can make things very crisp and sharp from front to center, but that doesn't happen in real life either, because when our eyes focus on something close, things behind that are out of focus, right? But here with photography, we can get it all sharp if we want to. We can record a blur, a moving object that is almost even hard to tell what it is if we allow it to blur by using a slow shutter speed. Or we can photograph a horse race and find out in a very close race which horse crossed the finish line first, because we can freeze that instant in time by using a very fast shutter speed. So all of our creativity lives in our ability to use these equivalent exposures. And so part of the process is to learn those equivalent exposures and to really be able to rattle them off out of your head. So things like, f4 at 250, that's a pretty shallow depth of field, but you could use 5.6 at 125, f8 at 60, f11 at 30, f16 at 15, f22 at 8. And you would like to be able to call them off out of your head, just like I did with no notes. Kind of a daunting task, but it's a task that you should aspire to if you're going to use your in-camera meter, right? But I digress, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But here again is an equivalent exposure, f11 at 30, that still keeps my meter right in the center. I'm free to use all of those. And so we've done enough of this now. I think you kind of get the idea. There's proper exposure. There's 2 stops underexposed. There's 1 stop overexposed. And our goal is always to get it right in the center. So why is proper metering so important? Well, if you had these tools available to you, you could do this at home. And I like to demonstrate this in a live class, but we're not going to do it live. So you're just going to see the results of this. But if you can acquire yourself a white card, a black card, and a true 18% gray card, you'd have to order that from Arlington Camera or some other camera store to get yourself a true 18% gray card. But if you photograph each of those one at a time using the very same lighting environment, then you'll find something very interesting happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to photograph my white matte in the same light that I'm going to photograph my gray mat, and then I'm going to use it in the same light to photograph my black mat. And when I'm done photographing those three things, these are the actual photographs that came out of my camera. This is not trick photography here that I'm about to show you, okay? These are the actual images that came out of my camera. And there they are. So the one on the left was the white mat. The one in the middle was the gray mat. The one in the right was the black mat. And yet they all turned out identically gray. Now, why in the world would that happen? Well, remember what we said at the beginning. The camera uses that metering mode that you choose, from spot metering to center weighted and so on, and takes an average of all of the tonal values that it sees and delivers an average value back to your meter. Well, we deal with all kinds of tones. We deal with black and white and all the tones in between. But what's the average of black and white if we mixed them? It's gray, right? So your camera's job is to deliver an average result of everything that it sees, because chances are it sees Bridget's black hair and her white door, and the tonal values of the highlight side of her face, and the tonal values of the shadow side of her face, and the tonal values of her painted walls back there. And it doesn't know what it's photographing. It just knows it sees all these tones and tries to deliver an average exposure. And so that average exposure is gray. It's called or represented as 18% gray. And when your camera delivers that, you know it's working perfectly. That's what we want it to do, because camera meters measure reflected light reflecting off of everything in the environment. The only time that it's not measuring reflected light is when it's measuring backlight, like an illuminated sign or a neon sign or a light bulb. Otherwise, the door, Bridget's face, Bridget's hair, everything that we see on her, we can see the reflected light. And that's what the camera meter does. And it takes that measurement of all of that reflected light and averages that scene to 18% gray. So what are we supposed to do with this information? Well, they never tell you this when you take your camera out of the box. What you're supposed to do with this information is not put it on program and assume all is well. Program is just a tool for anyone to be able to pick up that camera and get an average picture. And how many of you strive to be average? Well, not many of us. Most of us work really hard to get proper exposure. So average exposure's not ideal. But let's take a look at it in practice. Here we are in an environmental scene, and I've set my focus point to the box in the center, and I'm pointing it, just centering everything in the image as I'm going to compose it. If I use that setup, knowing what we've just learned, what color would we expect that dress to be if I shoot this at f8 at 125?
Gray.
It would be gray. And do we think the dress she is wearing is gray? Nope, it's white. Yet, this is what the camera tells us is the proper exposure. But if we used f8 at 125 in this setup, that dress would be gray. And every other highlight in there that's white would also be gray. her skin tone would start getting muddy and dark, and all of these shadow areas would start getting black and dark because the exposure is not really f8 at 125 if we take the measurement right here off of her dress. It would give us a gray result. In practice, what we want to do is look at the scene and try to evaluate where is the 18% gray point in this environment. In other words, where could we take that exposure reading off of? And so if I look in the scene, I don't want to take it off the water. I don't want to take it off these highlights in the background. This is pretty dark all in all. Wouldn't want to take it there. This is, sort of neutral, but where are the best gray tones that I have? I would argue that it's somewhere in this area here or up in this area here, perhaps even over here. So if I had my camera set where the center box was activated as my point of focus, I would turn my camera so that box was on this area to take my exposure reading. I would take my exposure reading and I would dial my f-stop and shutter speed until I got that graph back in the center. Okay. Now I'm not using this point to focus. I'm using it just to measure the light or measure the reflected light. Then I'm going to, because now remember I'm in manual mode, I'm not going to change the exposure when I change the composition because I have physically set the f-stop and shutter speed. So I'm going to recompose the image, maybe use this box as my point of focus. And guess what? The graph is going to go crazy on us. The graph is going to say, oh my gosh, this is way overexposed. You've got to do something about this. And what you've got to do is train your mind to ignore that meter at that point because you measured it off of the point that you felt like was the mid-tone value of that scene. And now you're just using that box to focus, if you will. So we're going to use the meter in step one when we activate it with the box and point the box over there. But when we set the camera, f-stop and shutter speed and ISO, and we recompose the image to take the picture, we're going to ignore what the meter says because it's going to be wrong. Okay. Sometimes you get into environments and you don't know exactly where the 18% gray point is. I would suggest that, especially in a portrait environment, probably the safest thing you could do is meter right off of the skin tone, meter right off the face. Even if you're not composing it this way, take that spot meter off the face, but you still may have to maneuver it just a little bit over or under exposure, depending on if they're really got light skin or dark skin, because again, it's not really reliable without knowing what the 18% gray point is. So in this example, I would be using this as my focus point and my metering point. Now, I mentioned earlier about doing silhouettes, and silhouettes is the one time where the in-camera meter works perfectly. I mean, it's no pun intended, spot on when you use it for silhouettes, as long as you do the technique correctly. First of all, you want to make sure you have a very bright background, and that there's virtually no light on the subject. Doesn't mean it has to be like this late in the day, but you just don't want to add fill flash or anything like that. So you simply point your camera at the brightest part of the background or the brightest part of the sky in this case. And that graph is going to go way over there to the overexposed side, but you just keep dialing and dialing and dialing until you get the graph in the center. And once it's in the center, you will have properly exposed the background, at least for the brightest part of that background. Then you recompose with your subject in between the camera and that bright background, and you get some of the most marvelous silhouettes you'll ever see. They run beautifully that way. And that's not to say that you can't do a little fiddling with that. Here's an image where I wanted a little bit of detail on my subject. I wanted to see your face a little bit. So I metered the background and then backed off of it a little bit, slightly overexposed it because I needed a little bit of light on my subject as well. But again, in manual mode, I have all of that control, where in program, I have none of that control. If you're not using the Sunny 16 rule, this is it. I might let you take a second to photograph the screen or look it up online, but this is kind of the starting points of outdoor lighting situations under sunny conditions, cloudy, bright conditions, overcast, and heavy overcast. And by rule, we know what the exposure is on those types of days. Sunny day is f16 at 125 if you're using 100 ISO. If you're using 400 ISO, then a sunny day is f16 at 1/500th of a second. So you plug the ISO into that equation and then interpret it as a shutter speed. Always move to the faster speed. So 400 ISO becomes 1/500th of a second. 200 ISO becomes 1/250th of a second. And then you can use that really and take it to the bank. The hard part's really knowing the difference between cloudy, bright, and overcast and that sort of thing. But the other thing that you have to be aware of is making sure that the lighting is on your subject, not necessarily other parts of the scene. Excuse me. I had a lady one time saying, she was in a class and she wasn't showing me her pictures. And I'm like, well, why aren't you showing me your pictures? She said, well, they're just not turning out very good. And I said, well, let me see them. Well, no, I don't really want you to see them. Well, I really want to see them. No, I really don't want to see them. Well, let me just see them. So finally she shows them to me and they were very, very dark. And I said, so why do you think these are so dark? And she says, well, my husband was working inside his garage and it was a sunny day outside. So I set my camera to f16 at 125. And I said, I think we might have missed something here. Yeah, it might be f16 outside, but you weren't outside in that light, right? It's got to be the lighting on your subject. And so it's a great little rule to start with. And when I do outdoor workshops, that's really the method that we use to determine our exposures. It's kind of eye-opening for folks to learn to do it that way. Now, I do have people all the time say, well, you know, I'm a photographer. I don't use program. I use aperture priority. And I'm like, oh, okay. So you don't really care about your exposures, do you? Well, what do you mean? I said, well, because you're still getting an average exposure. Oh yeah, you get to choose the f-stop, but you're letting the camera choose the shutter speed with no regard to what the exposure really is. You know, some will set their shutter speed and let the camera choose the f-stop with no regard to what the exposure is. And so that to me, that's a baby step, but it's not shooting in manual yet. So let's take a look at, if you're one of those who uses program aperture priority or shutter speed priority, how can we get better exposures when we're using those tools? Well, we would use our exposure compensation controls. I'll show you on my camera once again. Well, you can see on the screen, it's this little box that will have a plus or a minus on it. And usually it's a little button that you press down and then you dial one way or the other to change the exposure compensation. And the idea behind this is that you're going to tell the camera about certain situations where it is likely being fooled and it's likely not making the best decisions for you. Here in this image, I've got my exposure compensation set to minus 1/3 of a stop. So let me show it to you here, just so you can see it. Okay, so here's my little plus or minus box. When I hold that down, you see the graph's right in the center. Hopefully that's where your graph is. If it's not in the center and you've been using aperture priority, shutter speed priority, or program, you have been compensating your images all this time and probably never knew it. So you want to hold that button down and make sure that graph is right in the center. If you turn, oops, there we go. If you turn the dial, you can move that and tell it, I want you to intentionally underexpose or intentionally overexpose. But as soon as you're done with that image, you want to make sure you go back and put your exposure compensation back in the center again, because otherwise you're overriding all of the program, all of the aperture priority, and all the shutter speed priority settings that you've been using. So be sure you have that in the center. So let's look at situations where this might come into play. And there's two primary places where this comes into play. One is if you've got a really bright background. If you've got a really bright background, the camera wants to, like squint. It wants to close the lens down, or it wants to speed the shutter up because it sees all this light and it thinks it's really bright. What it doesn't know is that you don't really want a silhouette. You really would like to have detail on your subject, but never mind, it's got a bright background. And if that's the case, if you're using this kind of background and your subject's in front of it, that's really a mistake on your part, because you'll never be able to control both the background and your subject without adding some sort of supplemental lighting. But I digress. If this is the environment you're in and you want to put some light on their faces, then you could add 1 or 2 or possibly even 3 stops of exposure compensation. So remember what's going to happen. Here's your lens, right? It sees that bright background and it closes down because it thinks it's bright. And it gives you the result of what it thinks is the proper exposure. But you're going to tell your camera, look, I know you think that's correct, but I need you to open up 1 or 2 or 3 stops, depending on how you set it, because I know you're looking at an exceptionally bright background and I don't want you to base your exposure off of that. So when you do that and you intentionally overexpose, you now can get at least something on their faces, but obviously this is unacceptable for the type of work that we do, right? But it's how that works. Just so you know, it's how that works. The other arrangement that you get into is when you have a really dark background. And so, gosh, it makes me want to go to Vegas. You go out to Vegas and you want to shoot the fountains at Bellagio, and you put your camera on program or aperture priority or whatever you use. And what does the camera see? Well, it sees mostly dark. Now, I realize those fountains are lit and the Bellagio has light on it, but I promise you the reflections in the water are quite dark and the sky is very dark. this is dominated by darker tonal values. So as a result, the camera wants to open up because it thinks it's dark. Well, you recognize that the camera can't know what you're seeing. It thinks it's photographing something dark, but oh my gosh, there's something really bright in there that I'm interested in. So you've got to tell the camera to underexpose it by 1 or 2 or 3 stops and sort of think for it, if you will. And when you do that, then you get the exposure that you were hoping for on Bellagio and not a lot of blown out fountains and highlights. Now, this is the same situation that you get when you go to the ballet recital, or you go photograph. You go to the, let's go to a George Strait concert. And you're sitting in row XX in the top of the arena, and he's down on the stage, and there's a bright spotlight on him, but everything else is dark. Well, this is kind of the same environment. So always recognize your backlighting and your dark backgrounds as requiring some exposure compensation. Now, remember, shooting in manual mode, there's the ultimate exposure compensation. You're telling the camera exactly what you want it to do. If you're using auto ISO, you're not telling the camera anything. It's deciding pretty much everything for you. You may think you're choosing the exposure, but you're not. The ISO is really variable, and it changes with every scene. So we want to be able to set that ISO, set that shutter speed, set that f-stop to get exactly what you want. And remember, when you're using even spot metering mode, you're still returning an 18% gray result. So it's your job to interpret what it sees. If you're using that center box on that girl on the white dress, the camera's going to turn that white dress gray. So you've got to recognize that, and you would use your exposure compensation and tell it, open up about a stop in 2/3 so that dress doesn't turn gray, and then hopefully you'll be happy. But they never tell you that with your in-camera meter, that your job is to interpret what it says, not to accept what it says. Does that make sense? The only way to use your in-camera meter and do it with certainty is to take all of your measurements off of an 18% gray card. So have your subject hold the 18% gray card wherever the light is where they're standing. Use your spot meter to take your measurement right off of that gray card. Get the graph to the center. And when it's in the center, you can take all the pictures you want. You'll be properly exposed. Ignore the meter because it's going to go crazy when you take that gray card down. But you will know you measured properly because you took that measurement right off that gray card. Those of you who do landscape work, take your gray card with you and meter off of a gray card for your landscape work. You say, well, gosh, Steve, I'm photographing these elk on the other side of the river. I can't go over there and get them to hold my gray card. Well, are they in the same lighting on their side of the river that you're in on your side of the river? Is it the same light? If it is, just hold the gray card in your hand and measure it right there. You don't have to go over there if the lighting's the same. If you're in the sun and they're in the shade, then you might have to create some shade with your gray card. Now, let's pretend this is a gray card. It's not a gray card, right? But I know if I point it up this way, I'm going to get a version of light. If I point it this way, I'm going to get a version of light. Yes? So there's my shade. I can measure my gray card in the shade right there. So, I can even, I could Well, you get the idea. You can manipulate. You can hold that gray card the wrong way. Look at Bridget, for example. Look straight into the camera for me, Bridget. She's got a highlight side on the right, and the shadow side is on the left. There's a little bit of a kicker or highlight just underneath her left eye there, or our left, but most of the light's coming in from her on the right. So if she's holding the gray card, you want to point that gray card towards that light source and measure the light coming from the light source, not facing it towards the camera. Okay? Because we want to measure the light on the subject. We'll learn more about that here in just a minute. But what we talk about with our handheld meter and the way we use our gray card there, the way we use our handheld meter is exactly the same we would use our gray card. So are there any questions about our in-camera meter for right now? I'll let Bridget look and tell me what she sees. No questions. So I'm either doing a good job or y'all know it all and I haven't taught you nothing. All right. Well, let's go look at our meters. Have to reset a little bit. All right. So let's take our handheld meter and let's go back to those three mats, our white mat, our gray mat, and our black mat. Remember, when we did this with our camera, we photographed each of those cards in the exact same lighting environment, and we took the readings by pointing our camera right at the card using aperture priority, shutter speed priority, or program, or even auto ISO. This time, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put the lights in that same lighting environment, but this time we're going to put our meter out there and put our meter on top of the card, and we're going to measure each of those cards once again. And sure enough, what happens is when we do this, the readings on our meter are exactly the same. Why? Well, because the cards are underneath the meter, right? But what the meter is doing is it's measuring the light falling on the card, not the light reflecting from the card. That's a big distinction. You see, when we measure the light reflecting off the card, the light doesn't change. So why does the exposure change in our camera? Why is there a 6-stop difference between the white card and the black card? Well, because we're measuring reflected light. When we take the measurement with our handheld meter, it doesn't care what's underneath it. It doesn't care because it's measuring the light that's striking that dome. It's measuring the light that's hitting that meter, and it doesn't matter what's behind it. So it's measuring the light falling on the subject. Okay? It's my opinion that a handheld light meter, at least for professional use, is not really optional. I make my students buy a meter. They don't have to buy a terribly expensive one, but oh my gosh, there's so much that meter does for them, and it completely rocks their world, as hopefully it will you as we get through talking about this. Remember, it measures light falling on the subject, not the light reflecting from the subject. Most of the handheld meters have the ability to measure both flash, portable strobe, as well as ambient light. The other great thing about them is that you can quickly run through all those equivalent exposures. Remember those equivalent exposures I challenged you to learn? F16 at 125, F11 at 250, F8 at 500, F5.6 at 1,000, F4 at 2,000. You can spend a lot of time learning that, or your meter will just tell you that. And you can go meter something, 5.6 at 125 and say, well, I really want to know what the exposure is at 2.8. And so you just punch in 2.8 on your meter and it tells you what the shutter speed is. You don't have to figure it out on your own. So that should be worth the price of admission alone right there. And then some of them have the ability to trigger a flash because they have a built-in transmitter. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So the handheld meter is an incident meter. It measures light falling on the subject, where your camera meter is a reflected meter. It measures light reflecting off of your subject. So let's do some little basics about meters here. I'm gonna change camera views. Well, before I do that, I have a couple of different meters with me. If you have a meter like a Sekonic L358 or the Sekonic 478s or any of these other types of meters, one of the things that you probably will notice is that there's a dome. Some of the domes are retractable. You can push them in or dial them in, or you can dial them outward. Are you able to see that? In and out. Okay. Some of them have a little dome that you can slide over the lens. You move it left or right to cover up the lens, depending on the meter. Some of them may have a flat dome or a flat disc on the meter, and they don't have this bulb-like dome at all. And gosh, there's others out there. So I have no idea what I would run into with this many people on a call. But this is kind of primarily the scene that you see with a dome that you can either move it in or out, or you can at least replace a flat dome with a flat disc with a dome. You just unscrew it and you pop the dome on it. So hopefully one of yours is like that. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and change this view. Take the screen share off because I think it'll be easier to see. All right, so I'll start with the Sekonic L358. I'm gonna turn it on. I said I'm gonna turn it on. Oh, wrong button. It's hard to look at the screen and look at the meter at the same time. And so all of the meters have kind of similar markings. This one has a sunshine and then has a little flash symbol. Hopefully your meter has those as well. You'll see this particular meter has a flash symbol with a little small C next to it, and another flash symbol with a little small T next to it. I'll come talk about those in a minute. But over here, we have the ISO. Okay. Here we've got a shutter speed. I know that's a shutter speed because that's marked by T for time. And then it's showing me an f-stop that's marked by the F. And then it's got a little graph here that we'll talk about here in a bit. But mainly, it's just these markings, this mode, ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed. On this meter, I'll let it get booted up. I have the same things. I have an f-stop, I have an ISO, I have a shutter speed. There's the time button. The mode on this is found by touching the gear. And here you'll see the same things we saw over here. The little sunshine, the flash. Here's the flash with a C. And here's the flash with something that looks like a T. And hopefully you can see that. So just the basics, all meters would sort of have these items in common. So what I want you to do is I want you to start playing with your meter a little bit, especially those of you who've never touched your meter. If you've been using your meter for a long time, you can go get a cup of coffee or another glass of wine and join me back here in about 5 minutes. But for the rest of us, we're going to play with our meters for a minute. I want you to begin by changing the mode. So I'm talking about this little sunshine icon right here. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to press this mode button, And when I press this mode button, I should be able to dial, and you see the little box moving at the top there. There it's at the T with the C. There it's there, and now it's the T with nothing on it. Excuse me, the flash icon, I'm sorry. And then here it is with the sunshine. So I want you to mess around with that, and let's get your meter into the sunshine mode. If you have this meter, it's very simple. You simply just click on that mode button and you can click on the sunshine mode. Now, on this meter, you'll notice you have choices for some cinematic settings as well as lux settings. The two that we're primarily interested in here would be the T setting or the F setting, and I'll talk about those here in just a moment. Okay, so you got it around the sunshine. I changed my mind. I want to put it around the flash. Move your meter in the mode and put it in the flash mode. Any luck there? Okay. Well, I don't know why we would put it in flash mode because we don't have our flashes with us. Let's go back to the sunshine mode. What? Now, let's talk about those flash modes for a second. The first flash mode with nothing else on it is just for measuring flash. You're going to have to hold the meter and fire the flash, or have someone else hold the meter while you fire the flash, or you have to hold the meter while somebody else is firing the flash. So you either need really long arms or two people to make it happen. The flash with the C stands for corded flash. And what that means is that you would have a cord that runs from your flash unit that plugs into the meter, plugs in right here in this little PC port, so that when you go to corded mode, as soon as you press the button, it will send a signal through that cord to fire your flash. The flash with the T setting is transmitter mode. And it just so happens that this meter has an optional built-in transmitter. If you open up and look at the back, this is an optional piece that you can buy that makes that a Pocket Wizard transmitter, so that if you've got a Pocket Wizard receiver on your flash or on your studio flash, then your meter will fire those flashes just when you push the button. So you don't need any help. You don't need a cord. You just push the button and you're firing your flashes. It makes it very, very convenient. By the way, if you're using the Sekonic L358, I encourage you to look in the back. And if you want to set your meter up to be like I meter it, I would push all those pins in the downward direction. Now, if you're happy with your meter the way it's working and what you're doing, just don't touch those pins at all. But for what I do, I push all those pins in the downward direction, and I'll show you what that does here in just a moment. Okay. Now, there's one more little thing that's sort of a little tricky. How many of you have this meter? Okay. So what's tricky about this is it takes a little bit of a touch. It takes a little bit of gear awareness, if you will, because there's actually a couple of different modes in that sunshine mode, or that ambient light mode. And what I want you to pay attention to here as I change this, I want you to watch this box right here. Right now, I've got a box around the F. As I go through this, I'm going to start over here in the flash modes. You're going to see that box move back and forth between the F and the T. So watch this. Hopefully you can see this with no glare. So here I go. I'm going to be I'm in flash mode right there. But when I dial it into ambient mode, now I'm on the sunshine and the box is around the F. If I dial it one more time, now the box is around the T and I'm still on the sunshine. And I can rock back and forth between those two modes. See that? And so you want to kind of get that feel down to be able to determine which ambient mode you want to use. So what does that mean? Well, what that's telling you is when you put the box around the F, you're telling the meter, I want to know what the shutter speed is when I set my f-stop to F4. So it will always give you the appropriate shutter speed based on F4. If you put that box around the T, you're going to choose the the shutter speed that you want, and it will always give you the f-stop based upon the shutter speed that you selected. So this is going to be important to you. If you're hand holding a 200 millimeter lens, by rule, we know we can't hand hold that lens at speeds less than 1/250th of a second, unless you have image stabilization of some sort. But if you're hand holding it, the rule tells us always use a shutter speed that's at least faster than the focal length of the lens. So it might behoove you to always know what your f-stop is at 1/250th of a second. On the other hand, if you want to shoot everything with a shallow depth of field, you might want to put the box around the F, set your meter to 2.8 so that you always know what the corresponding shutter speed is to 2.8. Does that make sense? You get to prioritize it. In this meter, you simply choose that mode. Do I want the to set the f-stop myself, or do I want to set the shutter speed myself and get my result? So here I'm choosing the shutter speed. It's telling me the f-stop. So I also mentioned, well, let's do this. To take the reading, you just push this button on the side and it gives you the corresponding f-stop and shutter speed at whatever ISO you set. This one does the same thing. You just push the button on the side. You've chosen the ISO. It gives you the corresponding f-stop and shutter speed. If you want to know what the equivalent exposures are, you just dial this little wheel and it runs you through all of the equivalent exposures. You can use any of those. This one, you just push the little arrows up and down and it gives you the corresponding equivalent exposures. Pretty simple. So if you have your meter, why don't you take a few meter readings just for fun? Set your meter to 800 ISO, set it in the ambient mode of your choice, and go walk over near a light source. Get close to the light source, hold your meter right by the light, take that reading, move it around. See the different exposures that you might be getting. I'm going to let you play for about 30 seconds. All right. I don't think anybody got up and played. Maybe Liz did. I can't tell what Carol's doing. But the premise is you want to put that meter as close to your subject as you can, or in the environment that's as close to the lighting on your subject as you can. So like I say, you don't have to go cross the river to get over there to that herd of elk. You can do it from right where you're standing. But it is important that the consistency of distance between your light source and your meter stays true. So the sun is no further away from you than it is from that herd of elk. But if you've got your flash on camera, that meter needs to be right there on your subject, because we're trying to measure the light falling on the subject at the point of the subject, if that makes sense. All right. And as we talked about Bridget's face before, if the light's coming in from our right, her left, as we see it, we want to point that dome towards the light source, not towards the camera. Exactly, Bridget. Some folks want to put it towards the camera, but if it kind of point it more towards the camera for me for a minute, Bridget. Even more towards the camera. Okay. That dome has the same characteristics on it as her face does. It's brighter on one side than it is on the other. Well, that's not really helping us measure that light, okay? Because it's taking into account some shadow. Now, the tricky part about this is we base our exposure on the highlight side of the face. And in doing so, we're responsible for those shadows, right? Even though those shadows may get darker than we want them to be, we don't want to change the exposure, because if we change our exposure to lighten those shadows, what are we doing to those highlights? We start blowing them out, okay? So our job is to measure those highlights and then add whatever necessary fill or reflector or change of lighting direction to control those shadows, because we're working really hard to create those shadows. We're responsible for them. But this is a light meter, not necessarily a shadow meter. Now, it will measure shadows, but we want to set our exposure based upon the light on our subject. Now, sometimes, especially in a studio environment, we have more than one light on our subject. We might have a main light, excuse me, and a fill light on our subject. And so it's possible that we would want to take different readings for each of those lights so that we understand where that ratio falls. And that's where our choice of dome or flat disc comes into play. I'm just going to say, if you have a flat disc, that's my preference. Now, you can dial that in, and that gives us, in essence, the flat disc. But there's a problem with this that I want to explain to you. First of all, with the flat disc, I can now point my meter over here to that light. Bridget, point it to that light. And I can measure that light, and it's not being interfered by whatever light is over here, right? And then if I want to measure that light, I can put it over on this side, and it's not being tampered with by that main light on the other side. So the flat disc allows us to take independent measurements without being influenced by the other light that may be falling on our subject. And that's really the way I like to use it. The problem is I've seen if I have 24 students in my class at Texas school, I see 23 of them making mistakes every time they take their meter out and measure it because they're just not careful. They take their meter, and if the light's over here, they point it like that. And they think they're getting it towards the light, but it's not unless it's over here, right? Or they take a meter reading outside and they kind of hold it up here like that, or they forget what they're doing and they hold it like that. And sometimes I've even seen them hold it like this, like there's magic light coming out of their nose or something. And so I will just say that as an instructor, I advocate dome out, because dome out helps eliminate some careless metering technique. That's not to say it's my preferred method, because it's not. But you have to be very deliberate about the placement of that meter with your subject if you're using the flat disc method. If you just want to be as close as you can and not have to worry about the details, and leave the dome out, and you should be fine. Even if she points it at the camera, she would be a whole lot closer to correct with the dome out than she would have been if the dome's in, because that would be a disastrous measurement with the dome in based on the lighting that she's in. Okay. The next thing that we have to deal with are these pesky little tenths of a stop. And those of you who pushed all those pins down on your meter, if you followed my lead, here's what I did to you. I just set your your meter up to measure in tenths of a stop. And that's what this little number is right here. So when I look at this meter, the exposure is 5/6 and 3/10 at 1/125th of a second at 400 ISO. And these 3/10 matter to us because we need to pay attention to those. So here's another little setup. In my classes, I advocate setting up the camera in half stop increments. So because we're shooting in manual mode, what I want is them to be able to go from 2.8 to 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and 22, hit those whole stops, and then hit the half stops in between. So it's, 5/6, 5/6.5, 8, 8, 8.5, 11, 11, 11.5, 16, and so on. Not that a half is really and truly a half, but it's close. If you don't set your camera up in half stop increments, then you're probably set up in 1/3 stop increments. So as you dial your camera, you go from 4 to, and I'm using the values, not the actual numbers. You'd go from 4 to 4 1/3, 4 2/3 to 5/6, and then 5/6 to 5/6 1/3, 5/6 2/3, and then 8, and so on. I'm eliminating those 1/3 steps and putting it into half steps. That doesn't mean you have to do that, but because I shoot in manual, I just want to dial my little wheel 3 times or 4 times to get where I'm going, not 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 times to get where I'm going. Okay. And honestly, there's not any real discernible difference between 5/6 1/3 and 5/6 1/2, or 5/6 1/2 and 5/6 2/3. No real discernible difference between F8 and 1/3 or F8 and 2/3 compared to 11, and so on. So half stop increments makes it much easier for someone to shoot in manual to navigate through their settings on their camera. If you do that, or even if you don't do that, you still want to pay attention to these 1/10 stops, because we either need to round it up or round it down to the closest f-stop that we have available to us. So for example, let's look at this list right here. If my meter tells me F8 and 2/10, it would be F8 right here, F8, 0, and a little 2 right here. If it said F8, 0, and 2/10, I'm just going to set my camera to F8. I'm good. I'm going to be 2/10 of a stop overexposed, but I don't care. It's not enough to hurt anything. It'll be brilliant and awesome and fantastic. If it reads out F11.0 and 8/10, I certainly don't want to use F11 because I'm 2/10 of away from being F16. I'm much closer to F16 than I am F11. Does that make sense? So you got to pay attention to that 1/10 of a stop. If I'm at 5.64, then I'm going to go to that setting that's between my 5.6 and my 8, that little halfway stop. Because remember, my camera's in half stop increments. I don't care what the number is. You can look it up if you want to. I think it's 6.7 or 7.1 or something. I don't even remember what it is. But I just know it's the halfway point between 5.6 and 8. And so that's the setting that I'm going to use for 5.64. At F8.7, well, now I've got some decisions to make. Do I want to use F8.5 or do I want to round it up to 11? And I will just say in that case, I'll be happy with F8.5 once again. I'd rather lean towards very slight overexposure, just a little bit. I shoot in RAW anyway, so it's not going to hurt me. But it is very important you pay attention to that number. 2.0 and 9/10, that's a 2.8, f2.8. So you definitely have to be careful about that. All right. Any questions? Bridget, anything out there?
No, nothing.
Okay. Then I'm going to show you the last thing I think we're going to talk about, and we'll be done. And that is calibrating your meter. Because I've taught enough classes at Texas School that I have seen meters come right out of the cellophane wrapping, come right out of the box, and they didn't work properly. It's just the nature of electronics. And so they're such precise, delicate instruments. It's nice that we have calibration tools available to them that we can double check ourselves. And so what I want us to do is calibrate our meters. Now, we're not going to be able to do it tonight, but I'm going to show you how to do it and then let you do this on your own time as you see fit. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go out on a full-blown sunshiny day. Don't go out late in the afternoon. Don't go out early in the morning. Get out there midday, full sun. Don't be on the shaded side of the house. Be where the sun can shine brightly on your meter. Set the meter to 100 ISO. Set the ambient mode or the sunshine. I don't care if the box is around the T or the F, but if it's around the T, set it to 125. Actually, let's set it to 125. That's probably the smartest thing we could do. Put the box around the T, set it to 125, and then point that dome directly at the sun and push that button. What we want that to show is f16.0, not 16 and 2/10, not 16 and 3/10, not 11 and 8/10. We want it to say 16.0. Again, it's got to be a full-blown sunshiny day. If it is not full-blown 16.0, then we need to calibrate that meter. And the way you do that with the Sekonic L358 is you hold these two buttons down at the same time. Excuse me, these two buttons down, ISO 1 and ISO 2. When you hold those down, you can see an adjustment comes up, and then I can either add those 2/10 or I can take away those 2/10 or 3/10 or whatever that measurement is that I'm off away from F16. So if it's F16 and 2/10, you want to put that to minus 2/10. I'm going the wrong way. They're minus 2/10. If it's F11 and F11.8, then you want to add those 2/10 and then take that reading again, and it should say spot on F16 at 125. So double check that. You might want to check your meter now and see if it's had some sort of monkey business with it, because a lot of them have. If you have this meter, then we're going to go to the menu. And in the menu, we're going to go to set exposure compensation. And here I can add those 2/10. Excuse me. Or I can subtract those 2/10 as needed and just hit OK. So that's how you would calibrate that meter if you're not getting a spot on F16 on a sunny day. Tony Corbell calls these a truth meter. And I think that's correct, because it always gives you what the proper exposure is. No interpreting, no guessing. If the light striking that dome that is the same light that's striking your subject, that's what the exposure is. Now, you may not like your backgrounds being so dark or so bright, but your exposure is spot on, where that never happens with your in-camera meter. It's always a guessing game. The other thing that I'm going to tell you is when you start using your metering, something's going to happen, and we're going to have to have a fight about it. You're going to start telling me, well, Steve, I started using my meter and my camera meter and using my gray card, but my pictures are so dark. And I'm going to say, well, that's because you've never seen a properly exposed image. You've just gone through this far in your camera life and seen average exposures, because a properly exposed image, when you make that shift, they're going to look dark to you. And you're going to look on the back of your camera and you're going to say, gosh, these are dark. I think I need to change it. Don't change it. Leave it. Because the only way you can truly evaluate it is if you look at it when you get home on a properly calibrated monitor. And if your monitor's not calibrated, guess what? Your monitor's lying to you, just like your camera is. And when you have your camera lying to you and your monitor lying to you, and you make the adjustments because you believe what you see in front of you, then you're royally messing it up when you send it to the lab, and they're having to undo all the mess that you made. So don't change it. You've got to change the way you see the world in a properly exposed photograph, because it is going to look dark to you. It's just going to. I often tell the story about my trip to Colorado, where we work with we're equal opportunity photographers. I work with Nikons and Canons alike, and we all get along, and there's just no politics about it. But I work with the Sunny 16 rule, and we learn to evaluate proper exposure by seeing it and not necessarily by using our meters. It's not that I'm opposed to the meters. I definitely am pro meter, but I kind of want to train them in this method. And so I'm doing this workshop in Colorado, and everybody's getting along. We're all having a good time. But on the next day, I'm up on the cliff, George, the camping area where you camp in that overlook. We're photographing downtown Ouray from that overlook, and I see an unauthorized Nikon meeting going on to my right. And I can tell they're ganging up about something. Something's going on, and they keep looking over at me, and I keep looking back at them. And finally, one of them, I guess, draws the short straw and has to come over and talk to me. And I'm not going to mention any names, but Dean Dominguez walks over and says, "Steve, we've been talking. We've been doing your exposure method here for a day now, and we just don't like it. We like our method much better." I said, "Really?" They said, "Yeah, our exposures just look better than yours, and so we're just going to go back to our way." And I guess seeing there was no violence, they all kind of surrounded me, and now I was in the middle of a terrorist group of Nikonistas. And I said, "Do you all agree?" And they're like, "Yeah, we really like ours better." And I said, "Okay, well, I'll tell you what, before you do this, I want you to take 2 pictures for me. I want you to photograph downtown Ouray, just, this Main Street area down there. And I want you to take one your way, and then I want you to take one my way." And they said, "Well, okay, well, we can do that." And so they take their pictures, and then they take the second one, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, ours are so much better. We love our pictures. We're right. Yeah." And I said, "Okay, yeah, I hear you." I said, but wait a minute. I want you to do something. I want you to dial in that picture that you like so well, the one you did your way. And I want you to zoom in on that white building right there on the corner of 2nd and 3rd. Just zoom in on it as close as you can get." And so they're zooming in, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, we got it. It's a white building. Look, it's white. We're happy." And I said, okay, but do me one more favor. Take the one that you did my way and do the same thing. Zoom in on that white building. "Oh, yeah, we can do that." And they're zooming, and their faces just kind of start going, And I don't want to mention any names, but I said, "George Bucksbaum, what do you see when you zoom in on that white building?" And he looks at me and he says one of the most beautiful things that's ever been said to me as an instructor. He looks at me, he looks at his camera, and he looks up again and he says, "Bricks." I said, "Oh, bricks. You see bricks in that white building?" He said, "Yeah, I see bricks." I said, "Well, did you see bricks in your white building?" "Well, no, there were no bricks. It was white." And I said, "Well, do you think it's important that you see bricks?" Yeah. So, what do those bricks represent? And they said, "Detail in the highlights." I said, "Bingo. So which way do you like better?" And they said, "Well, why are these pictures so dark?" And the answer was, because you've never seen properly exposed photographs. You're using a camera with a reflective meter that's averaging everything it sees. And if you could kind of separate yourself from that beautiful screen in the back of your camera. And by the way, I'm not picking on Nikons, but they have a luscious screen in the back. Those colors are vivid and amazing. I wish the world looked that way, but it doesn't. And if they could hold that camera up and look at it with this eye while they're looking at the environment with their other eye, they would see the trees in their camera are much brighter than the trees over there on the other side of the mountain. The trees on the mountain are dark, but they've gone so used to accepting what they had seen in the camera that brightening everything up was normal to them. And I guess they would take those images home and open them up on their iMacs, not picking on my Macs, but they have the most luscious display out there. Colors are so vivid and rocking, but it's a lie. And if those iMac people would calibrate their monitor, they would look as dark and dingy as our PC monitors do, because you believe what you see in front of you. And this is going to be the hard part for you guys, is accepting that your properly exposed pictures are going to look dark. Trust me, don't make any adjustments. Whatever you adjust on your non-calibrated monitor looks crappy on someone else's monitor that is calibrated. And if you're entering image competition and it goes to those calibrated monitors at districts or IPC or whatever competition you're entering, you just don't realize the crap you're sending them because you believed what you saw. I spoke to the lab about this one time, and they said, you know, if people would just send us the file right out of the camera and not adjust the brightness and the darkness or the color, they'd be far better off, because we have to try to undo their messes. And I believe them because I've seen it. So it'll take you some getting used to. Just trust it and trust that meter. I'm not saying you might not have a problem with a meter. Out of 100 people with meters, it wouldn't surprise me at all to see 3 that aren't working properly at all. Maybe more than that. But let's trust it until we can isolate the problem. Because if you don't stay consistent, we can't figure out where the problem lies. And I'm happy to help you if you're having some exposure issues, whether you're using your in-camera meter or your handheld meter. But stay consistent so that we can figure out where the problem lies. My guess is you're not going to have any problems at all. You're going to have great photographs. And once you get past the fact that they look dark to you, when you get past that, honestly and truly, I'm just going to say this. When you get past that, you develop something that is so lacking in the photographic world, and that is discernment. You now recognize what a properly exposed photograph looks like. And that's huge. You now put yourself in a higher elite status among photographers who really understand exposure and not just being happy with what you put out there. You know, this is really simple, interesting thing. You got to understand your camera meter changes exposure as you zoom, as you tilt a little left and right, up and down, you know, whatever. That exposure is constantly changing. But my question is the light changing? No. So if you set it in manual based on the light you measured, you're going to have consistent images no matter what, whether you zoom or don't zoom or zoom in, zoom out, tilt, and whatever. If you want to know how dramatic it is, just watch this. Do you see that exposure changing? It's always changing unless you're in manual mode. Crazy, isn't it? That's what your camera's doing. You zoom in a little bit, you zoom out a little bit, exposure's changing. You don't want that. You want it consistent. And the only way you're going to get that is to shoot it in manual. I got time for a couple of questions. And I think we're done. Was that fun? Was it interesting? Did you learn anything? I know George didn't learn anything.
I
Always
think it
learn
was great.
something.
No, I think it was great. I think it's important. I mean, I'm taking notes about calibrating.